Well, hello. I am Steve Higgins, your instructor for English 132. You hopefully know that, but I am here today to talk to you about the short story, How to Tell a True War Story. We are having a virtual day on campus today, and because of that, I'm recording this lecture that is a condensed version of what we would have discussed in class had we been present on campus. Today, we are talking about the story by Tim O'Brien, How to Tell a True War Story, which is a prime example of a style of fiction known as meta fiction. Now, metafiction is probably most recognizable to most students as breaking the fourth wall in TV programs and film. When a character speaks directly to the audience and seems to be aware of the fact that they are a character in a movie, a character in a TV show, or a cartoon. Included on Blackboard, I have the video of a pretty classic example of fourth wall breaking meta-fictional storytelling in animation. The Looney Tunes cartoon from the 1940s, Duck Amuck, starring Daffy Duck. In this cartoon, Daffy Duck is supposed to be playing a swashbuckling character, but the background that he is against changes from a castle to a farm. And so he hops off camera and he comes back in farming gear. And then the background, as he's walking along, the background changes to a snowy landscape. So he hops off and he comes back on skis. And this keeps happening. Changes keep happening to the background. The background gets erased, and he's complaining to the animators, like, hey, why aren't you doing your job here? So he's interacting with the people making the cartoons. He's interacting with us, the audience, and saying, can you get a load of these guys? And this kind of thing keeps happening to him over the course of the whole cartoon until you get to the end. And it turns out that Bugs Bunny is drawing this Daffy Duck cartoon. And so it leaves you with this question of like, wait, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck are in Looney Tunes cartoons together, but in this one, Bugs Bunny is the animator who's creating this cartoon starring Daffy Duck. Like, how does that work? Metafiction. Uh, a character from other cartoons is creating a cartoon starring characters based on his friends, essentially. Um, you might also be familiar, if you're a fan of the Marvel movies, with Deadpool. Um, Deadpool is a character that's constantly breaking the fourth wall and interacting with us, the audience, and through his narration and actually within the scenes, he makes little jokes, little aside jokes. Like there's one in the first Deadpool movie where he holds up a magazine, People magazine, that shows that Ryan Reynolds is the sexiest man alive, while he, Ryan Reynolds, the actor, is portraying a character called Wade Wilson who has scars all over his face from very drastic burns. Perhaps my favorite metafictional joke in Deadpool is when Colossus in the very first Deadpool movie is taking Deadpool to go see Professor X, and Deadpool says something like, "Oh yeah, McAvoy or Stewart?" Making a reference to the two different actors, James McAvoy playing the young version of Charles Xavier and Patrick Stewart playing the older version of Charles Xavier in the X-Men movies. That's only something that audiences will get, that he understands as a character because he's aware of the fact that he's in a movie. So that kind of is a demonstration of what metafiction is. Now, in our case, in this story written by the author Tim O'Brien, who was a soldier who had fought in the Vietnam War and then wrote a book called The Things They Carried, which is a collection of short stories, of which How to Tell a True War Story is one of those stories. And he says to us in the very beginning, this is true. So you would think that this is based on his own experiences. And in fact, Tim O'Brien is the narrator of this particular short story. However, by the time we get to the end of the story, he reveals to us that no, he made it all up. None of these characters were real. None of these people in this story were, in fact, actual people. This was a fictionalized version of his life. This is He's inserted himself as a character into this narrative. So it's a pretty prime example of metafiction, and it thus then makes us aware that this is not a traditional story. This is not going to follow traditional plot structure of that plot curve of an inciting incident, rising action, climax, resolution. This story doesn't really have any of that. It's also interspersed. The details of what happened in Vietnam are interspersed with his instructions to us as if we want to write a story about our own war experiences, how we should go about doing that to make it feel real to its readers. So, it's a jumbled kind of story that isn't very traditional because it is this example of the style of fiction called metafiction. Um, Tim O'Brien has self-inserted himself as a character, as the narrator of the story, even though that's not the real Tim O'Brien. None of this actually happened. The plot of this story is ostensibly about the death of a guy named Kurt Lemon. We are told about Kurt Lemon's death in this segment of the story, right here on page 432. That Kurt Lemon, Rat Kiley, other guys in their troop, Tim O'Brien being one of them, another guy, Mitchell Sanders, being one of them. They are Norman Bowker, Kiowa, Dave Jensen. There's a bunch of guys in this troop that they are out on patrol. They are walking through the jungle, marching through the jungle, looking for the enemy, seeing what they can find. And it's boring. It's a boring mission that they are on, to just walk around in the jungle. And finally, they get to take a little bit of a break. And instantly, Kurt Lemon and his best friend Rat Kiley start playing this game that they've made up that is essentially like hot potato. They pull the pin on a smoke grenade and they toss it back and forth between the two of them. And they're doing this to see if one of them is going to chicken out. They're toss, 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 toss. Oh my gosh, it's going to explode up. And you throw it away, and that person then loses. Or if you don't, you toss, 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 toss it back and forth until it explodes on one person. Now, luckily, it's just a smoke grenade. It's not an actual grenade. But that person catches it, go, and they're coughing, and the other person's laughing at them like, haha, and then they do it all again. And the point of this is, they're kind of young guys in the middle of war, and it's a dangerous situation, of course, but it's also really boring. You don't want it to not be boring because that means you're going to be fighting for your life, scared that something bad might happen to you. But in those in between times, it is pretty boring, and they're just doing this to pass the time. And so we get to this part of the story here. It's hard to tell what happened next. They were just goofing. There was a noise, I suppose, which must have been the detonator, so I glanced behind me and watched Lemon step from the shade into bright sunlight. His face was suddenly brown and shining. A handsome kid, really. Sharp gray eyes, lean and narrow-waisted. And when he died, it was almost beautiful, the way the sunlight came around him and lifted him up and sucked him high into a tree full of moss and vines and white blossoms. So they're goofing around 1 second, and the next second, one of them's dead. The tragedy of that, the tragedy of the fact that Kurt Lemon wasn't killed in a firefight, for the, saving the rest of the men. He wasn't, doing something important. He didn't face an enemy that he could say, you're to blame for my death. He literally took a step backward, a half step. He could have just as easily not done that and lived, but he took a half step backwards and he accidentally triggers a mine, an explosive device, and he's dead, just like that. The tragedy of that. One of the things that the story's trying to present to us. That drastic tone shift, that change in mood, that change in atmosphere that comes, 1 second you're goofing off, the next second you're dead. But also, Tim O'Brien describes this moment very poetically, almost as if it was beautiful. Like when he took that step, the sunlight came to rush around him and lift it up into the sky. Um, very poetic, very somber, very beautiful, the way that it's described. That is one time in this story we hear about Kurt Lemon's death. We hear about Kurt Lemon's death over and over and over again. We keep coming back to it, the things that happened before it, the things that happened after it. And it's kind of hard to follow the chronology of these events. Just kind of know the stories about Kurt Lemon's death. We hear about things that happened before, during, and after that incident. And later in the story, towards the very, very end of the story, we hear again about Kurt Lemon's death. And the way that it's described this time is much more matter of fact, much, much different. And it is here on page 438, right there. In the mountains that day, I watched Lemon turn sideways. He laughed and said something to Rat Kiley. Then he took a peculiar half step, moving from shade into bright sunlight, and the booby-trapped 105 round blew him into a tree. The parts were just hanging there, so Norman Bowker and I were ordered to shinny up and peel him off. I remember the white bone of an arm. I remember pieces of skin and something wet and yellow that must have been the intestines. The gore was horrible and stays with me. But what wakes me up 20 years later is Norman Bowker singing Lemon Tree as we threw down the parts. So this time, when he describes Kurt Lemon's death, it is not poetic and beautiful. It is graphic and gruesome. And Tim O'Brien does not shy away at all in this story from telling us the graphic, gruesome details. It's a very difficult story to read. One that, unfortunately, one time, many, many years ago, I was teaching this story to a class full of students, and unknowingly, one of the students in the class had just lost his older brother in Afghanistan. And that student, when we got to this part talking about this story, he walked out and never came back. And I've always kind of regretted not giving a little bit more of a warning. This is hard material. Tim O'Brien wants us to confront the gruesome reality of war, and this is it. And so he takes that moment that he had described as poetic and beautiful, and now gives us the gory details. First, matter of fact, it happened. The guy was dead, just like that. And then I had to pick bits of him out of a tree. And that's horrifying. But the other guy up in the tree turns it into a joke, makes it comedy. He starts singing a song about a lemon tree while they're picking bits of their dead friend named Lemon out of a tree. They talk sometimes about people who've been through traumatic experiences. The only way they can cope is through humor, by turning it into a joke, by laughing it off. And actually, what we learn about Kurt Lemon over the course of the story is that he was one of those types of guys. He was always trying to make things into a joke, whatever they were doing. And you do get the impression that Kurt Lemon would have thought this was hilarious. He would have laughed himself, like, that's a great joke. I love it. If he was alive to hear it, but he's not. He's dead. And so we have these two descriptions of Kurt Lemon's death. Poetic and beautiful, gruesome and horrifying. Tragic, comedic. Which is it? We're kind of left wrapping our brain around this contradiction. And in fact, Tim O'Brien talks about that in this segment on page 437, one of the segments when he is giving us instructions on how to tell a true war story. He says, well, how do you generalize? War is hell, but that's not the half of it, because war is also mystery and terror and adventure and courage and discovery and holiness and pity and despair and longing and love. War is nasty. War is fun. War is thrilling. War is drudgery. War makes you a man. War makes you dead. The truths are contradictory. So what he's saying here is, when you have a giant concept such as war, it's never going to be any one thing. In some moments, you are fighting for your life and it's terrifying. In other moments, you're bored. You're bored to tears. And so we see that contradiction with Lemon's death. Nothing is ever just one way, especially something as big as a concept as war is. We can never fully wrap our brains around the entirety of it. We can only look at it in little pieces and understand those pieces, and we have to acknowledge that that's only one piece, that's only one facet, that's only one side of things, it's only one way of looking at things. There could be other ways, alternate ways to look at things that could be equally true. And so, if two things can be true, if Kurt Lemon's death can be beautiful and gruesome and tragic and comedic, then how can we ever know what truth is? We kind of have to acknowledge that truth is at least a little bit subjective. Again, this is something that Tim O'Brien addresses himself in the story immediately after the first time he describes Kurt Lemon's death. He addresses us again directly to talk to us about how to tell a true war story. And there's the bit with Kurt Lemon's death, and immediately underneath that, he says, in this segment right here, in any war story, but especially a true one, it's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. What seems to happen becomes its own happening and has to be told that way. The angles of vision are skewed. When a booby trap explodes, you close your eyes and duck and float outside yourself. When a guy dies, like Lemon, you look away and then look back for a moment and then look away again. The pictures get jumbled. You tend to miss a lot. And then afterward, when you go to tell about it, there is always that surreal seemingness, which makes the story seem untrue, but which in fact represents the hard and exact truth as it seemed. So now my interpretation of that, and again, as I've said in class multiple times, this is my interpretation, one person's interpretation. If you see it differently, that's absolutely valid as long as it's supported by the text. But my interpretation of that is, you think about how in real life our senses can play tricks on us. You see somebody walking towards you from a long distance away and you think you know them and you start to go to wave and they get a little bit closer and you realize that's not your friend that you thought it was, it's somebody else. But in that moment, you saw a piece of that person, or you saw the back of their head or something, and you're like, oh, I recognize that person. And your brain has filled in the gaps. It's object permanence that psychologists talk about, that we don't need to see the whole in order for our brains to grasp what a thing is. It's a reason why we can do jigsaw puzzles. You can take a little piece of the puzzle, even if you don't have the picture, and you can say, okay, well, this is probably grass, this is probably sky based on the color, and you can start to sort things out, and you can start to put things together, and you recognize what the picture is, only seeing a part of it. Corporations want to make sure that their logos are instantly recognizable, that you don't have to see the entirety of the Starbucks logo. All you have to see is a fin of the mermaid to know, hey, that's Starbucks. Coca-Cola has trademarked the color red of their cans so that you can just see that color and recognize Coke. They want you to see a piece and extrapolate the whole. That's what our brains do. But because of that, our brains frequently put together pieces wrong. We think we see something, we think we hear something, and we put those pieces together and we believe that that's true, but it's only a small piece of it. It's not real. It's what our brains are telling us the truth is. Our memory cheats as well. Any of you who have had conversations with family members about childhood events probably know what I'm talking about, where you and a family member, maybe it's a sibling, I think it's especially true if you have siblings, you get into arguments sometimes with siblings about, like, that's not how that happened. I remember, I was there, I saw it happen, this is what happened. You were too young, you don't know what really went on. Different people perceive events in different ways. That's why eyewitness testimony can be so prejudicial, so flawed, because you think you see something and you put the pieces together, and is that what really happened? Is that really true? And that seems to be what Tim O'Brien is kind of hinting at here, that, when somebody dies, you don't go, you're like, oh no, and you don't see the full picture, but your brain puts the full picture together, especially if it's a traumatic circumstance. Um, your brain's going to put pieces together. Your brain's going to erase pieces. Like, nope, this is too difficult for you to handle. We're just going to wipe that away so you can't remember that. Um, and so, how can you ever know what really happened if our senses are how we know what we're seeing, what we're experiencing in a given moment, what we see, what we hear? If our memory is how we know what happened to us, and those things are incredibly flawed, how can we ever know what truth is? Now, Tim O'Brien is not like encouraging us to throw out the idea of truth entirely. Absolutely not. We come to a consensus as a society of what truth is. We hear these stories. History has been built of like these are these various people's accounts of what happened, and where all those accounts kind of coincide, the Venn diagram at the center of the circle, that is what we assume to be the truth. And we acknowledge that maybe we're not 100% right, but to completely throw that out is the realm of conspiracy theorists. Put on your tinfoil hat, you won't ever believe anything again. And he's not telling us to do that. He's not encouraging us to believe in the Mandela effect or that the universe was reset in 1988 because of some anomaly, and now things are slightly different from the way you remember it. That the Fruit of the Loom logo doesn't have a cornucopia around it. Like silly, silly stuff. You just remember things wrong. People are unwilling to admit that they're wrong, unwilling to admit that, maybe I just am misremembering things. No, it couldn't possibly be flawed. What I know to be true is true. Again, he's not telling us to throw all of that out. What he is telling us is it's about consensus. Truth is subjective, but in order to know truth, in order to know your truth and my truth, we have to share those truths. Remember, this is how to tell a true war story. It's about truth, it's about war, it's about storytelling. Those three things are key themes in this story, and it's right there in the title. Truth is subjective. How do we ever understand truth? Through telling each other stories. The story itself, how to tell a true war story. Let's go back to that. Um, Involves storytelling in multiple different ways. The very first incident of the story that we are told about is Kurt Lemon's best friend, Rat Kiley, writing a letter to Kurt Lemon's sister after Kurt has died, after Lemon has died. And he's writing this letter with the idea of this guy meant the world to me. I know he meant the world to you too. We are both grieving this loss of this person we cared about deeply. Let's bond, let's connect, let's share in that grief and lessen that grief by sharing it. That's the intent behind the letter that he writes. However, the way he writes the letter, that message gets lost a little bit. He's telling stories about what a goofy guy Lemon was, telling stories about how he tossed hand grenades into the river to catch fish. The bits of the fish would rain down into the boat, and that's him going fishing. On Halloween, this real hot, spooky night, the dude paints up his body all different colors, puts on this weird mask, and goes out on ambush almost stark naked, just boots and balls and an M16. A tremendous human being. Now, again, the intent behind this story is like he took the fear away, the anxiety away, the nervousness I felt about being in this dangerous situation by turning everything into a joke. He made it bearable. He made life out here easier, and it's going to be so much harder for me without him. And I know that you're suffering, that your life is going to be so much harder without him. Let's share in that. The problem is this version of Kurt Lemon that Rat Kiley knows is not the version of Kurt Lemon that his sister knows. Stop sharing for a moment. Because I went like this, it raised my hand. Wow. Okay. Sorry. Um, I hope you all see that in the video and you're not just like, what is he talking about? But I like went like this and it said, your hand is raised. Do you want to lower your hand? And I'm like, what? Um, sorry. Anyway, back on track here. Well, it wouldn't be a Higgins lecture without a Higgins tangent, would it? uh, so the version of Lemon that he talks about knowing, that Rat Kiley knows, is not the version that Lemon's sister knows. I mean, that's natural. You're not the same person to your best friend and to your grandma. We contain multitudes. We are multifaceted. And so those versions of us might not fit together. I am a different person to all of you than I am to my wife and child most of the time. Sometimes I slip into teacher mode and my friends will call me on it. My wife will call me on it for sure. Um, like, hey, I don't need a lecture here. It's not what we're doing here. We're different people in different circumstances to different people. And unfortunately, Lemon's sister can't see that. Lemon's sister can't legitimize the version, that's not the right word that I'm looking for, cannot reconcile the version of her brother that Rat Kiley is describing with the version of her brother that she knows. And so she rejects it. She rejects that reality because it doesn't match up with her own. Rejects that version of her brother that Rat Kiley knew and never responds. And that causes great consternation for Rat Kiley that he never gets a letter back. He calls her a rude name as a result of that. So that's one example of storytelling. He is sharing his truth, but the details get in the way of the deeper meaning. The plot gets in the way of the theme. The facts, quote unquote, hide that subjective truth. And so she never responds to it. That feeling of failure of connection is key in that moment. Now, the next part of the story that um, deals with storytelling is in the center of the story. There's a big chunk. And when you read the story, you probably were like, why is this in the story? It starts at the bottom of 432, goes through 433, 434, 435, to the top of 436. A huge, huge chunk of this story is Mitchell Sanders telling Tim O'Brien a story about something that happened to other guys, other soldiers. And so you're like, what does this have to do with the death of Kurt Lemon? This has nothing to do with the death of Kurt Lemon. And yet it takes up 4 or 5 of the 11 pages of this story. It's a huge chunk, smack dab in the middle. And so plot wise, you're right. It has nothing to do with the story. Thematically, on the level of the deeper truth, it has everything to do with Kurt Lemon's death. It's the same kind of thing, getting at the same meaning. So what Mitchell Sanders is telling Tim O'Brien, and this is interesting too, because, again, um, there's us, there's Tim O'Brien telling us this story, there's Mitchell Sanders telling it to Tim O'Brien, and there's the guys that it actually happened to. So the distance between us and the people in this story is very, very far, if it was even true. But of course, Tim O'Brien tells us in the end he made it all up. But let's take it on face value that this incident really happened to some soldiers. Mitchell Sanders heard about it, tells Tim O'Brien, tells us. Let's take that as understood that this really happened. That these guys, they're going out on a listening post. It's going to be their job to go out on a mission in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the woods, and just listen. Listen for enemy movement. And if they hear anything, they're supposed to call in artillery to bomb the enemy that is in that area. Otherwise, they keep strict field discipline, absolute silence. Now, I want you to think about silence for a moment. Awkward, isn't it? I mean, that was maybe 5 seconds, but I paused and you were like, wait, did the recording glitch? Is something wrong with my computer here? Happens in an actual class, happens when you're giving a speech. You lose your place for a second. Now I public speak for a living, and so I go off on tangents and I make mistakes and lose my place, and I do it all the time, and it's nothing to me. This is normal. This is my life. But if you're inexperienced with public speaking, then those moments where you freeze up for just a split second are anxiety inducing. You're terrified. You go on a date with somebody that you're pretty sure they're into you, you're definitely into them. And so you suggest, hey, let's go out sometime, just the two of us, not in a group, but just the two of us. And the person agrees. And you're out with them and you're having a good time, you're talking, you're chatting, things seem to be going well. And a moment comes when suddenly silence. And you start to spiral in your head about, oh my God, why aren't they saying anything? Why aren't I saying anything? I should say something to break the silence, but I don't know what to say. And it feels like words disappear and it feels like words are never going to be said by anyone ever again. These situations are average, normal, everyday situations, but they're awkward and they're scary and they're anxiety inducing. And it's just a date. It's just a dumb class. It's not life or death like what Mitchell Sanders is describing here. Mitchell Sanders is describing a situation where you have to go out into the jungle and be careful not to make any noise, because if you make too much noise, the enemy that you're listening for out there might hear you and come and kill you. There's a reason why they've made 3 A Quiet Place movies. That idea that noise could equal death is scary. And it's the reality these guys have. They can't talk to each other. They can't make connections with one another. They can't joke around to ease the tension. And that's something that Mitchell Sanders describes specifically in this story, in this part, that they can't joke it away. They can't laugh it off. They have to just be quiet and listen for the sound of noises in the jungle that could be someone coming to kill them for 7 straight days. And so it's no wonder that it starts to get into their heads. They start to hear things, their senses play tricks on them, and they start to hear things that they couldn't possibly be hearing. Music coming right out of the mountain itself, right out of the rocks. They they can't possibly be hearing what they think they're hearing. Again, they can't joke it away, they can't talk to each other. They just have to all know they're hearing the same stuff. And it gets worse and worse and worse. They start to hear chamber music. They hear violins and shit. A glee club, a boys choir, barbershop quartet. Um, they start to hear a party, a cocktail party. Um, they hear the champagne corks. They hear the actual martini glasses. They're hearing noises, sounds that they can't possibly be hearing. And it's a symbol, essentially, that war is dangerous and scary and without a chance to joke it off, without the connection of fellow soldiers to ease the tension. It gets into their head and the fear eats away at them. And their senses play tricks on them and they can't cope. So they call in the artillery and they bomb the ever loving hell out of the mountainside. And then once it's done, they march back down the mountain. And it says that their commanding officer comes up to them, asks them what they heard. Why did they call in this airstrike? Um, I mean, they spent $6 trillion on firepower, and this fat ass colonel wants answers. He wants to know what the fucking story is. But the guys don't say zip. They just look at him for a while, sort of funny like, sort of amazed. And the whole war is right there in that stare. It says everything you can't ever say. It says, man, you got wax in your ears. It says, poor bastard, you'll never know. Wrong frequency. You don't even want to hear this. Then they salute the fucker and walk away because certain stories you don't ever tell. Now, the point of that bit of the story is These guys know that if they tell the story of what they went through to this audience, their commanding officer, he's going to say, "What's wrong with you? You couldn't possibly have heard what you're saying that you heard out there. You wasted all that firepower. You're in deep trouble now because of what you did." He's not going to understand. He's never been out there on the front lines and had that fear work its way in. He's never going to get it. So they don't even bother telling him the story. But one of those guys shared that story with Mitchell Sanders. And Mitchell Sanders understood. He's been on the front lines and he got it. So now Mitchell Sanders is telling Tim O'Brien the story in the hopes that Tim O'Brien will get it. And Tim O'Brien is telling us the story in the hopes that we will get it. But then Mitchell Sanders comes back to Tim O'Brien to talk to him about, like, did you get it? Did you understand it? I really hope you understood it. And Tim O'Brien clearly did. And Mitchell Sanders says, I got a confession to make. Last night, man, I had to make up a few things. I know that. The Glee Club. There wasn't any Glee Club. Right. No opera. Forget it. I understand. Yeah, but listen, it's still true. Those 6 guys, they heard wicked sound out there. They heard sound you just plain won't believe. So in one breath, he's telling us, okay, I had to make some of the details up of the story. But in the next breath, he's also saying, but it's still true. I had to fudge the details to get at the deeper truth. The plot doesn't matter as much as the theme. What did you get out of the story? What the connection that we have, communicator and audience, listener and speaker. Listener and speaker, reader and writer. What did you get out of it? Are we making that connection? Finding the right audience, knowing some people won't get it and certain people will. Are you one of the ones who will? Will you understand it? That's what he's hoping for. And so in the end, Tim O'Brien asks him what's the moral, and he doesn't want to say it. But then Tim O'Brien says, "Go ahead, Mitch, tell me the moral." For a long while he was quiet, looking away, and the silence kept stretching out until it was almost embarrassing. Then he shrugged and gave me a stare that lasted all day. Hear that quiet, man? There's your moral. Like, you get it? Do you get it? I think you get it. And I'm going to leave it right there. So that's the second time that we have somebody in the story tell us a story. And the third time is at the end, Tim O'Brien tells us about telling us the story of how to tell a true war story. He tells us in How to Tell a True War Story about how he's telling us how to tell a true war story. It's at the very, very end of the story that he talks about, sometimes I relate these experiences to people and I'm hopeful that they're going to get it, but sometimes they don't. It's this last bit here, right before the story ends. Now and then when I tell this story, someone will come up to me afterward and say she liked it. It's always a woman. Usually it's an older woman of kindly temperament and humane politics. She'll explain that as a rule, she hates war stories. She can't understand why people want to wallow in blood and gore, but this one she liked. Sometimes even there are little tears. What I should do, she'll say, is put it all behind me, find new stories to tell. I won't say it, but I'll think it. I'll picture Rat Kiley's face, his grief, and I'll think. And he uses that same derogatory term towards women that Rat Kiley used, because she wasn't listening. It wasn't a war story. It was a love story. It was a ghost story. So Tim O'Brien is like reaching out to us, reaching out to audiences as he's telling his story. And he admits, sometimes I fail. Sometimes I'm trying to get people to understand and they don't. They get too trapped in the setting, the details. The story is about war, but it's not about war. That's just where the story takes place. It's just what happens, not what it means. It's just the plot, not the theme. It's just where it happens, not what it represents. He's seeking a connection. He's like, do you get it? Do you understand? And so when he says it was a ghost story, it was a love story, the way I interpret that is It was a love story because Rat Kiley loved Kurt Lemon, best friend, like a brother to him. And when Kurt Lemon died, Rat Kiley was haunted by that loss, by that grief. Um, so, I mean, again, there's all kinds of themes here. It's a story about truth. It's a story about war. It's a story about storytelling. It's a story about grief and loss. It's about so many different things, camaraderie and friendship and so many. It's about connections. The frustration that can come from trying to connect with somebody, telling them your story, and they don't get it. If you've ever had the experience of telling somebody a joke and they didn't laugh, then you know that frustration. But that doesn't mean you stop telling that joke. It means you tell it again and you adjust the details, and hopefully this new audience laughs, and that connection, then you get that joke, you get me. You have the same kind of sense of humor. You thought that was funny. I thought that was funny. There's a bond. Let's build on that. Let's build on that connection. We're all seeking connections. We're all looking for who do we connect with? Who do we relate to? Who's our tribe? Who are our people? Finding those people is hard, and we tell stories to find those connections. And again, in this story, that's what he says. You can't say that. All you can do is tell it one more time, patiently, adding and subtracting, making up a few things to get at the real truth. And he says in the end, the real truth is that it's never about war. It's about the special way that dawn spreads out on a river when you know you must cross the river and march into the mountains and do things you are afraid to do. It's about love and memory. It's about sorrow. It's about sisters who never write back and people who never listen. It's about the connections that we make, he says, and it's about us. It's a story designed throughout the course of the story to elicit great sympathy for Rat Kiley. Tim O'Brien has written a story about Rat Kiley losing his best friend. It's a ghost story. It's a love story. Get a drink of water. It's a ghost story. It's a love story. And so it's about Rat. It's about Rat Kiley. And Tim O'Brien is telling us a story of Rat Kiley so that we can understand that connection, that friendship. And we see Rat Kiley's sorrow and grief when he writes that letter at the beginning of the story to Kurt Lemon's sister and never gets a response. He's reaching out in grief and he never gets a response. So again, we have incredible sympathy for Rat Kiley based on that. But at the same time, we also are told about something else Rat Kiley does. This is on page 436 of the story, that shortly after Kurt Lemon's death, Rat Kiley and the rest of the men are still marching through the jungle. And they come across this water buffalo. And he goes up to the water buffalo and he offers it some of his rations. The buffalo kind of sniffs at it and then doesn't want anything to do with it. And so when he reaches out to the water buffalo and it doesn't respond in the way that he hoped, he then starts shooting it. And he shoots it 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 and he shoots it. And he reloads. And he shoots it and he shoots it and he shoots it and he shoots it over and over and over again, graphically mutilating this innocent animal as a symptom, as an effect, I guess, not a symptom, as an effect of his grief. Rat Kiley was crying the whole while he did it. And the reaction of all the men in the group were like, oh my God, what the hell did we just see? We hear that story about Rat Kiley and we're horrified. Here's a guy we have great sympathy for, that he's grieving, and yet we watch him murder a water buffalo. How can those two versions of Rat Kiley be true? Because the truths are contradictory. People contain multitudes. War contains multitudes. We're too big to generalize that a person is a good person or a bad person. These are both expressions of grief. One is clearly a negative expression of grief, one is a much more positive expression of grief, but they're both expressions of grief. And those kind of value judgments of what's good and what's bad are something that Tim O'Brien is trying to say we got to take it out of it. Now, he's not saying that we can't ever judge anybody because, like, oh, well, person can be a good person but make one mistake and suddenly they're the worst person in the world. Like, no, there's like a preponderance of things. Not saying that people don't deserve a second chance. Sometimes people slip up and make a mistake and deserve a second chance, but sometimes people show you who they are repeatedly over and over again. Um, and yeah, that's bad behavior and that we have to reject that. But people contain multitudes. People can be great, great people, but also do awful things. People can be awful people and do good things. Like, it's all much more complicated than that. It's all shades of gray. Everything is subjective to a degree. And so, again, in the end, war is just a setting. A lot of what this is teaching us about is not war, not truth. It's not storytelling. It's about us. It's about the human condition. It's about the way we perceive things, the way we connect with one another, um, and the way we see the world is often best shared through stories. The way that we gain insights, we use literature. It's a story in a way that is about literature. It's metafictional. It's about storytelling itself and literature. And that is the filter we use to understand the things that happen to us, the experiences. We don't just tell stories in order to get other people to understand us. We tell stories to understand ourselves, what things really mean to us. And so there's one last bit from the story that I want to share and talk about to wrap things up. And it happens very close to the end here. Um, this bit right here. You can tell a true war story by the questions you ask. Somebody tells a story, let's say, and afterward you ask, is it true? And if the answer matters, you've got your answer. For example, we've all heard this one. 4 guys go down a trail, a grenade sails out, one guy jumps on it and takes the blast and saves his 3 buddies. Is it true? The answer matters. You'd feel cheated if it never happened. Without the grounding reality, it's just a trite bit of puffery, pure Hollywood. Untrue in the way all such stories are untrue. Yet even if it did happen, and maybe it did, anything's possible, even then you know it can't be true because a true war story does not depend upon that kind of truth. Happeningness is irrelevant. A thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. So that bit right there. Afterward, you ask, is it true? And if the answer matters, you've got your answer. I think what he's getting at there, again, at least my interpretation of that section of the story, there we go. It's about us. It's what you take from a story, what you learn from a story, the deeper truth, the deeper meaning at the heart of the story, that you can be watching an obviously fictional film, reading of obviously fictional story, and there'll be something in it that you want to believe. Somebody tells you a story and you say, did that really happen? You want to believe it. There's something in that story that you want to grab a hold of and take and take away from it. And that means in that way it is true. Doesn't matter whether it actually happened. Doesn't matter if it's based on a true story. Doesn't matter if it's an animated story about Muppets or fish or cars that talk. Who cares? What matters is what you take from it. And so he says, let me boil all war stories down to this one perfect example of what a war story is. 4 guys walking down a trail. One guy jumps on the grenade to save his buddies. We want to believe that's true. We want to believe there's something in the human spirit that would be willing to sacrifice themselves for other people. I'm going to give my life to save somebody else. I'm going to take a grenade for you. I'm going to throw myself in the path of a bullet for you to save you. I'm going to give of myself without thought of cost. to help someone else. And he says, in the end, it doesn't matter if it ever happened or not, because we want to believe it. We want to believe that's true. And in wanting to believe it, we make it true in the way that, like, maybe you don't jump on a grenade for somebody, maybe you don't take a bullet for somebody, but maybe you are down to your last $10 and it's, a couple days before payday and you're broke, but you see your friend who is completely broke, has got no money, and they haven't eaten yet today. And so you go to the store, you go to the restaurant, you get $10 worth of food to share with them. You're giving of yourself. You're not thinking of your own needs. You're giving to somebody else. You're sacrificing of yourself for them. And you've made that story true then. You've taken the meat of that story, the deeper truth at the heart of that story, and you've turned it into a reality. He says that's the beauty of storytelling. It can inspire us. And this quintessential war story, he says, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. So what he then does is he takes that quintessential war story and purposefully changes the detail. He says, for example, after he says happeningness is irrelevant. I love that line. Happeningness is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if something happened or not. It matters what you take from it. So he says, here's an example. 4 guys go down a trail. A grenade sails out. 1 guy jumps on it and takes the blast, but it's a killer grenade and everybody dies anyway. Before they die, though, one of the dead guys says, "The fuck you do that for?" And the jumper says, "Story of my life, man." And the other guy starts to smile, but he's dead. So he takes this story that he says, "I'm making this up, but I'm going to make it feel real to you because I'm going to give it a little personality, add some little salty language to it to make it feel more real. I'm going to change an important detail of this story. Guy jumps on a grenade to save others, but the blast is so powerful that it doesn't just kill the guy that jumped on the grenade. He's not able to contain it. Everybody still dies. Does that change the deeper meaning of the story?" He says. That's how I interpret this. He's getting at, like, it doesn't change it. The guy jumps on the grenade to save others. That act is the same, whether or not he's successful or not. It doesn't matter to him if everybody lives or everybody dies. He's still sacrificed of himself no matter what. The act is the same no matter the end result. The deeper meaning is still there. And that's why you take that same germ of a story, that plot point, and you change it up a little bit and you put it in the middle of Captain America, the First Avenger. Just a silly little Marvel story. Superheroes, not real in any way, but in that story, to prove Steve Rogers' worth, we get this moment where the Colonel, Tommy Lee Jones, he takes a grenade and he tosses it into the center of all these guys who are up for getting the super soldier serum and becoming Captain America. And all these big, tough guys go running. And little scrawny Steve Rogers jumps on the grenade. Doesn't care about himself, willing to die to save others. He's like, "Get back, get back." And when the grenade doesn't go off, because it's just a dummy, that was the point of this little test. Steve Rogers is shown to be the only one who had the heart, the only one who was willing to take that extra step, to sacrifice of themselves to save others. He's the one who clearly deserves to be Captain America. And so, guy jumps on grenade, dies, everybody's saved. Guy jumps on grenade, blast is so powerful, everybody dies. Guy jumps on grenade, it's a dud, nobody dies. Jumping on the grenade is the point. Sacrificing of yourself is the point. The plot doesn't matter as much as the theme, the deeper truth at the heart of that story. And that, in a lot of ways, is what makes this story the perfect example of what we're doing with the fiction essay, what we're building up to over the course of the fiction unit, why we're starting to wrap up the fiction unit now, is that you use the plot of the stories that we've discussed to guide you towards the theme, the deeper meaning. You all have read these stories. I've given my interpretations, but what's your interpretation? What truth do you see in the story? What deeper truth is at the heart of it? Show me that deeper truth. Give me the details of the story that highlight that in the hopes that I, your audience, your reader, will then connect with you and understand your point of view, the way you see the world. So that's how to tell a true war story. I said this would be condensed, but it still took about an hour. Um, and I'll see you all hopefully back in the classroom on Wednesday and Thursday. Thank you all very much.